This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook, and we're here at the 2019 UIC Medical Cannabis Symposium, and we're speaking with Mick Palmer. How are you?
I'm good, Andrew. Very good, thank you.
Mick, can you take us a little bit through your history as Commissioner of the Police Force, please?
Well, I'm a whole-of-life career police officer, really. I had 33 years in policing. I joined as a constable in the Northern Territory, finished up serving 25 years in the Northern Territory and with a gap in the middle. And 7 years of that was as Commissioner of the Northern Territory Police. I had 5 years away during that time and practiced and qualified through the Barristers Board as a barrister in Queensland and practiced there for 1.5 to 2 years before going back into policing in the Northern Territory. And then my last 7 years of my career was as the Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police. So I had 33 years in policing, a short time practicing as a lawyer. So I'm really a whole-of-life career police officer. Retired in 2001, and since that time I've been involved in a series of reviews for federal and state governments. And of course in that last 18 years or so I've got much more deeply involved in the issue of drug reform and medicinal cannabis and other related issues.
Now, you and I spoke back at the 2017 symposium.
We did.
But something I didn't pick up then is I didn't know that you practiced as a barrister. You've been on basically the whole side of the fence which has been against the use of cannabis. So how has that changed? How did that change?
How did that change?
I'd love to say evolve.
Well, it probably was a bit of an evolution rather than revolution.
Right.
I started having doubts about much of the drug policy or the enforcement of drug policy even as a fairly young police officer in the Northern Territory. And I wasn't alone, other police officers did as well, and as you know we talked about exercise of discretion I think last time, and so much of it was counterproductive to me that we were locking up the wrong people for the wrong reasons and giving them convictions, the pain of which or the penalty of which was far outweighed the crime, which in most cases were victimless crimes. So I started to question the lower end of the drug prohibition forum, if you like, quite early in my career. When I had 5 years out and 2 years practicing at the bar at Southport actually, on the Gold Coast, I became quickly known as an ex-police officer, so I found myself defending people, particularly young people on drug offences and similar offences.
Right.
And then saw firsthand, of course, the damage that could be done to otherwise law-abiding, very well-credentialed young Australians who were, some that I remember appearing for and defending, had applications in to join the Defence Force, had applications in to become teachers, were awaiting further final notification to become police officers, had visas awaiting to go to the United States, all that sort of stuff, all of which would have been jeopardised by a conviction. So that really cemented.
What about the medicinal use of cannabis back then? Did you have to defend that sort of use?
No. It wasn't really, that's back in the 80s, and it wasn't really on the radar. I can't remember discussions on medicinal cannabis in those days. It didn't, I must admit, didn't cross my spectrum. I didn't think about it very much. I then, really after I retired, was the first time I had much exposure to medicinal cannabis or to people using it, and found people actually approaching me to seek advice as to what dangers they were in sourcing marijuana for schizophrenia or epilepsy or for their children suffering cancer or those sorts of illnesses from the black market. What was my advice to them, which of course is pretty hard to give. They didn't want to break the law, they were fearful of breaking the law, but they tried everything else, nothing else worked, and in desperation they were turning to cannabis as a release or relief. So I really started to focus on it then. Then I became aware of Lucy Haslam in about 2013 when I really started to get deeply involved. And I met Dan, went to Tamworth, met Dan, saw firsthand the reality of the situation. I think you've got to personalise these issues before you really understand the consequences of a bad policy. That certainly happened to me. I went to the first conference that Lucy ran in Tamworth, watched Mike Baird, who spoke at the conference, and the level of the impact on him of Dan. Really Mike Baird almost solely changed his opinion, in my view, on the back of his experience with Dan, seeing firsthand the nature and level of the suffering.
So I said this in another interview today, and that was that, I hate saying it, but it seems to me that it's going to take a personal catastrophe for a politician, a high-ranking politician,
sadly,
to actually get not just hearsay, not just piecemeal actions, and not just slow action, but to actually get the cogs turning so that patients can access medicinal cannabis. It's not about... I'm not talking about recreational use here at all.
No.
I'm talking about offering succour to patients' pain, which they, as you say, they've tried things, standard care, and the standard care has failed them. What's your opinion? What do you think needs to happen?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, sadly, I think I think the more we can advertise and communicate the personal stories, the more personal stories we can hit politicians with in the most personal way possible, in the closest way possible, and we can expose them to the reality of the suffering by the sort of people we're talking about, the more chance there is of genuine reaction. I think you're right. I mean, sadly, you know, it took Christchurch to change the gun laws in New Zealand, despite the fact they've done it magnificently well now. It took Port Arthur in Australia. Sadly, that's the nature of the political beast. You know, it normally takes a pretty severe event to make any meaningful change or risky change, as politicians might say it, to policy. I think that's terribly sad, because I think the evidence screams out at you and is overwhelming. But I think that is the reality. I remember in another jurisdiction in my operational days, a government brought in mandatory penalties, mandatory jail penalties for property crime. The focus was essentially on Indigenous young men who were breaking into middle-class white homes in the area. And so when we argued against mandatory penalties on the basis that no two cases are the same, there's lots of reasons why kids commit crime. And some of them come out of very unfortunate, backgrounds that sort of half excuse or certainly explain the behaviour they get involved in. But they went through. The very first person who was arrested was the son of a politician.
Right.
Instantly, there were phone calls as to why we should not make exceptions. So, well, that's why you made it mandatory, so there can't be any. And I mean, I think that is the reality of the day, sadly. I'm hoping not. And I think there's enough dramatic evidence out there already if they take the time to look. Head out of the sand stuff.
So you've been, we said out of the sand. So you've been involved in quite a few reviews. Have any of them touched on the medical use of cannabis?
No. Not the reviews I've been involved in. They've more been focused on security. There have been some that are focused on drug use, because of the if you like, the relevance of drug use, or certainly being impacted by drugs on the security environment in which people work, like offshore gas rigs and so on. But I haven't been involved in a review focused on medicine cannabis.
Is it still viewed as a gateway drug by Parliament?
I think that's the fear. The comments I hear are, it's a gateway drug. It's part of the slippery slope to full recognition and regulation of, or legalisation and criminalisation of drugs per se. So they can't distinguish it. And I think the second very much gets in the way of the first. I think the argument that's put forward as we've now advanced into the medicinal cannabis arena of the lack of evidence and the need for real caution and extreme care and limiting access and so on is really a secondary consideration. The real consideration that slows it down, the real concern that slows it down, is that this can be seen by governments as going soft on drugs. And there's that fear politically that is still a big concern in the community. I think the fear is not really recognised. I think, as pill testing is showing at the moment, I think it's something like 63% of Australians support pill testing. Governments still want to deny it. So I think the community understanding is changing and the attitudes are changing, certainly in regard to medicinal cannabis. I almost never talk to anybody who doesn't think it's a great idea. And as we all have, I have several friends, one of whom lost a husband just in the last few months to a brain tumour, who were having to access medicinal cannabis for medicinal purposes on the black market. Were driving to Nimbin, business people who hated breaking the law, were very concerned about the fact they were doing it, but it was the only thing that gave him relief. And they did it. It gave him relief, but they had to break the law to do it. That didn't make any sense to anybody I knew, and of course a broad section of people who knew this family, who had pretty strong anti-drug laws. I watched their attitudes change on the back of this one experience.
Isn't it interesting? But it takes that. But it can't be over there. It's got to be here.
It's got to be here.
I mean, you mentioned gateway drugs before, and indeed, my slippery slope from using cannabis during university to, one of the most devastating drugs in our society, and that's alcohol.
Yeah, that's right. Happens to be lawful.
It just happens to be legal.
Yeah, that's it.
It doesn't
much more
make
dangerous.
sense.
Much more dangerous.
Much more dangerous.
Yeah.
It doesn't. I'd love to see somebody accused of aggression when they're high as a kite. But anyway,
that's right.
That's recreational stuff. I guess we've got to be mindful to keep the argument to the medicinal responsible use.
And that's the point.
And also think about how that's gotten to these patients, and it needs prescribers. So, you know, it's been allowed on the SAS now, and yet there's still this rigmarole. It's hard for GPs to access. They don't know what to access. They don't know what to prescribe. So you know, with this sort of, you know, constant parliamentary inquiry, and it's a current hot topic.
Yep.
How slowly or how quickly are the wheels turning? Are we looking at 2 years, 5 years, or a decade before we see reasonable change?
In time frames, I think it's pretty hard. I'd love to think 2 to 5 maximum. It is slow, and what I heard Richard Di Natale say this morning is very true, that it's a very frustrating process. I think we've got to continue to put pressure on politicians and make them realise this is not a vote winner. They have to put healthcare above ideology, and Australians want them to put healthcare above ideology. Yeah. And when you say it in those terms to almost anybody, right or left, they agree with you. Nobody argues with that. But ideology shouldn't drive this. Healthcare's got to drive this. This is a compassionate decision for compassionate reasons to really meaningfully reduce the suffering of those people most in need. And to have, you know, as they talked about this morning, 100,000 people unlawfully accessing the market and 1,000 people lawfully accessing the market is absolute nonsense and totally counterproductive to where we should want to be.
What about the notion that, oh yes, we'll give it on compassionate grounds, but those compassionate grounds aren't here. They're 2 years in the future when you're totally bedridden, totally in pain, not having any quality of life anyway. So it's this unreasonable delay to access.
I mean, it's a now issue. I mean, that's right. I mean, we've focused now on the palliative care environment, really, far too little too late. You know, the most dramatic examples really are children suffering things like schizophrenia, epilepsy, particularly epileptic fits, cancer, various forms of cancer. I mean, Dan was a very young man, Dan Aslan, when he contracted cancer, and a very young man when he died. I mean, you see those cases, you confront people with those cases, and the facts or the evidence, if you like, they can talk about it as being anecdotal, but it's evidence in front of you. It's what you call eyewitness. You know, we convict people beyond reasonable doubt for murder on that same evidence. When we don't want to use it as evidence, we say that's not evidence, that's anecdotal. Say, well, I convicted a lot of people of very serious crimes on anecdotes, you know, things that I saw or other people saw and gave evidence of. It's anecdotal, really, when you think about it, but it happens to be very strong evidence, and that's exactly what this is. And I think, you know, that's the reality. Those sort of people need care now, need access, open access to quality controlled medicine and cannabis now. That's why parents are mortgaging homes to go to the United States to access it. I mean, what is wrong with us as a society that we should even encountenance that, you know, even consider allowing that to happen, allowing people to go broke, having to fly to another country to get access to something, and then stopping importations or limiting importations and putting barriers in the way. You can't help but think, I can't help but think there's a lot of vested interest getting in the way of this in terms of traditional medicine, but whatever the reality might be, staying where we are should not be in any sense an acceptable option for Australia.
Wise and sometimes worrying words. Mick Palmer, thank you so much for joining us on FX Medicine.
Thanks, Andrew.
Today. It's a real pleasure. This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.